Hello, everyone. Great to have you joining us this afternoon. I'm Gronya. I'm the Education Coordinator for the Classical Association. And in a previous life, I was a Head of Classics for a comprehensive school in London. The Classical Association and the Historical Association have begun working together to support one another in supporting our memberships. We know that there's a lot of modern historians out there who are interested in ancient history, either out of personal interest, or we hope might be considering whether they might like to start offering ancient history in their schools. And so we thought that a webinar series showcasing what's so completely brilliant about ancient history and what our qualifications have to offer might be a good place to start. A quick plug here before we get going with today's webinar. We will be live from the Historical Association conference on Saturday, the 13th of May at midday. A panel of teachers who successfully teach both ancient and modern history in their departments will be joining us to share their reflections on how they made this possible. So if you're coming along to conference, we would love to see you there. It would also be great if you could tweet along. I have Steve Mastin, who's here representing the Historical Association, and James Renshaw from Godolphin and Latimer School in London with me this afternoon. Unfortunately, Arlene isn't able to join us, but you're able to tweet along to sort of spread awareness of this webinar series, and obviously it's another way that you can contact us in the future. We have planned to have a couple of breaks throughout this session to take any questions that have cropped up. So please do drop questions into the chat as and when you think of them, and we'll endeavour to respond to them as soon as we can. So here we are, session 1 of our 5 online webinars, an introduction to ancient history. We hope you'll be joining us for all of our webinars, but if you aren't able to, then as Olivia said, they will be recorded and they'll be made available shortly afterwards. By the end of today's session, we'll have answered these questions. Why you, as modern historians, should teach ancient history, what support is available to new teachers, what period of history we're even talking about when we use the term ancient history, and what kinds of sources do we get to teach in the secondary classroom. I'm going to hand over to Steve now, who, as a highly experienced teacher of both ancient and modern history, knows a thing or two about why modern historians should think about offering ancient history in their schools. Over to you, Steve.
Great, thank you very much, Gronya, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. I was a head of history at a state school in Cambridgeshire for 17 years, and I would probably say that the 5 people who taught history in my department would have thought of themselves as modern historians. That is, anything BC, and it just felt that it was a different type of history. So when we started our GCSE in ancient history, we already had 5 GCSE classes that were studying modern history, or history as it was called, GCSE history. And when we introduced ancient history, we had 1 GCSE class to begin with, and then by the second year, we had 2 GCSE ancient history classes. So that was 7 history classes in all, 5 modern and 2 ancient. But if I say that most of the teachers in my department considered themselves to be modern historians, I would say that's because they would have said that their specialisms were periods of history such as 20th century Russian history, or 20th century Chinese history, or German history, or some of them were 16th, 17th century English and British historians. And so when you start thinking of anything BC, for them, it sounded like it was a completely different type of history. When actually, when we introduced the new GCSE, that is the new GCSE that just began a few years ago, it was looking at Elizabethan England, which you wouldn't regard as modern history. It was looking at Norman England, which definitely is not modern history. So really, we're just adding on a few more centuries. So let's just look at 3 myths surrounding the teaching of ancient history. So if we look at myth number 1, that historians in history departments around the country would think of the first time they think of the possibility of introducing ancient history. I'm not a classicist. So the idea that if you're looking at Cleopatra, Alexander the Great, the Roman Empire, then you must be a classicist to teach that kind of history. And that's simply not true. Because, of course, a classicist is someone primarily who would be teaching through the languages of the past. So through Latin, through Greek. No one is assuming that teaching ancient history means understanding Latin, understanding ancient Greek. So if your degree is in history, or if your degree and those in your department is in history, then this course is perfect for you. And this series of webinars is perfect for you. So you don't have to be a specialist in the ancient world to teach the history of the ancient world. After all, many of you will be teaching Elizabethan England now at GCSE, or the Normans at GCSE, and you may not consider yourself to be specialists in those periods of history. It's exactly the same when teaching the ancient world. Let's go to myth number 2 that often crops up when history departments are thinking, GCSE ancient history, out of my comfort zone. The second myth is, I'm not sure my senior leadership team would go with this. After all, we don't have people in the department to teach it. Or how would we sell this to year 9? Or we don't do any ancient history at Key Stage 3. So how would we prepare pupils for opting for GCSE ancient history? Well, you might have guessed already by the number of webinars in this series that the Classical Association and the Historical Association are putting together. We're going to answer all of these questions. So I remember that very first conversation with my line manager when we were thinking of introducing GCSE ancient history. And we ended up teaching ancient history for 10 years before I left. And it wasn't just me who was teaching it. There was a member of my department who would have considered himself a modern historian who also started to teach it. And then when I left, there was a lady who came into our department who again thought of herself as a modern historian who ended up teaching ancient history as well. So there are very easy ways to sell this to senior leaders when they think, are we sure we can offer this? One of the biggest selling points is this is a unique selling point. Often the schools in your area will not be offering GCSE ancient history. And so for your historians in year 9, or at the end of year 8, if you have a 2-year Key Stage 3, for them to have that choice, will we do modern history, although it's not really that modern anymore, or will we do ancient history? That's really quite special to be a school that can offer both of those things within the same history department. So finally, myth number 3. Myth number 3 is to do with confidence. So let's say that you are warming to the idea, you like the idea of offering ancient history, but where would you start? I'm not a specialist in this period of history. I get that you don't have to be a classicist, but where would I start? Is there any support for introducing GCSE ancient history? Would I expect the amount of work I'd have to do to introduce a new syllabus to increase? And also, the ancient world, isn't that very much primary school? Well, this is a really simple myth to bust. And if you come to the future webinars, you'll see how easy it is to answer these questions. There's so much support out there, not just from the Historical Association, as you'll see in the future, the Classical Association, but there are various places out there where there is even funding for introducing the study of the ancient world into your GCSE history courses. So I'm going to stop there and hand back to Grania. I do hope that you join the rest of the webinars. And if you have any questions, pop them into the chat as we go along, as Grania mentioned, and we'll be answering them throughout the course of the webinar.
Thank you, Steve. And it's on that point about the support that is available to you as new teachers of ancient history that Arlene, who isn't able to be with us today, has very helpfully pre-recorded her section, and that's what she's going to talk us through now. She'll tell us about the wealth of support that is on offer if you are thinking about offering ancient history. Let's make sure I can share this video.
Hi everyone, my name's Arlene Holmes Henderson and I am the Outreach Officer of the Classical Association. I am an Associate Professor of Classics and Ancient History at Durham University, and I'm really delighted to be joining you for this webinar series and kicking off the first one with Steve and James. I'm going to sketch over the next 5 minutes or so what funding is available to you should you wish to introduce ancient history in your school. The great news is there's quite a lot of funding available if you're interested in introducing ancient history to your school. And given the constrained budgets that many history departments are working under at the moment, I hope that by the end of my session, you'll be feeling quite optimistic. So without further ado, I'm going to share just a few slides with you and talk through what is available. So starting with book grants. We know that setting up a new subject or extending the teaching of a subject from one key stage to another often requires an investment in textbooks or in other resources. There are two organisations that specialise in giving grants to state-maintained schools to do that for ancient history. The first, you'll see that the purple logo is the Society for the Promotion of Roman Studies, also known as the Roman Society, and they will give up to £500 to state schools that apply, and it's a really simple application form. It's around 2 pages. You simply say, I want to buy this number of these textbooks. This is where I'm going to buy them from. This is how much they cost, and you get it signed by your head teacher. I should say that the Roman Society will only give money for books which are obviously related to the Roman world. So if you are applying for ancient history, you just have to be a bit careful to make sure that the books that you ask the Roman Society for have an obvious connection to the Romans. There is also a sister organisation of the Roman Society called the Hellenic Society, or the Society for the Promotion of Hellenic Studies. And you'll see their logo includes a little owl, the Owl of Athens. And they provide funding, again, for books, but also for classroom materials. So if, for example, you want to raise the profile of ancient history in your department, you can apply to the Hellenic Society for some posters, or you can run little competitions and you can buy some pencils that have got ancient history, Greek type trivia on them. So what I will say is that the Roman Society and the Hellenic Society meet 3 or 4 times a year to consider these applications. So it's just worth having a look on their websites and working out when you want to have these resources available. And then I guess working back to make sure that you submit your applications with enough time for you to actually be using the resources in the lessons when that's part of your teaching plan. The Classical Association, that we are co-sponsoring this webinar. I'm really delighted to tell you a little bit about what we fund. We have grants for schools of up to £500, and the types of activities that we've funded in the past have been enrichment activities. So if as a history teacher, you think, yeah, I really want to introduce ancient history, but a lot of our students haven't really had the opportunity to do ancient history before, so we want to bring someone in to run a workshop. You can apply for funding from the Classical Association to get support in order to pay that person to come in and do the workshop, and also for any associated costs of the day. You just have to be really careful to read the rules on the CA website about the grants. We're really clear about what we fund and what we don't fund. And you can also read the types of activities that we've funded previously. Transportation is something that we do fund. So if your learners have been learning something in class and you think, actually, I'd love to take them to see this, you know, there's a Roman site that we could visit nearby. You can apply to the Classical Association for money for buses to take them to actually experience it in real life. You can also apply for funding to take students either by bus or by train to study days at museums, or even just on museum visits. So again, you'll see the long list of activities that we funded previously, and I'd really encourage you to have a look there. The support that we offer is not just financial, and I know that Gráinne will say more about this, but I'll just sketch here the fact that the Classical Association, as the National Subject Association for Classics, offers a lot of CPD for teachers, and we do that in collaboration with other organisations. We also have a podcast that I'd encourage you to check out. We have a range of resources on our website, freely accessible. You do not have to be a CA member to access these resources. We also, like the HA, have branches around the country, and that's a really great way, if you're starting out with ancient history, of meeting some excellent, inspiring speakers and also other teachers of ancient history locally. And finally, we publish lots of journals, and I guess the one which is closest to teaching history is the Journal of Classics Teaching, and that is an open access journal. So again, you do not have to be a member of the CA to access that. Anybody can access that with an internet connection. The final organisation that I want to talk about is Classics for All. They're a national charity which is committed to widening access to the study of classics in the state-maintained sector. And what they specialise in funding is teacher training. So if you think, yeah, I'm really inspired by all this ancient history, this is something I'd love to teach, but I don't have a subject background in ancient history myself, and I'd like my team to feel confident and competent to roll this out across the department, but we need some help. This is where Classics for All can step in. They can send a trainer to your school, which is usually somebody who's very experienced in teaching ancient history or somebody who runs a PGCE course. They will come, they will work with you in a bespoke sort of way, and they will help you to devise schemes of work. They will also help you to devise pedagogies. They will also be there to answer questions that you might have about how ancient history might work in your particular setting. And they will help you to monitor and track the success of ancient history, whether it's as a breakfast club, a lunchtime club, an after school club, or whether you're starting with it on timetable. And funding is available no matter which model you choose. They also collaborate with the CA on CPD nationally. They've got 15 regional hubs across the UK, and so that's something that we're really proud to say that we are collaborating as part of. They also, on their website, have a number of resources that you might like to have a look at, and they've recently launched a student forum. So if you've got some students who are super inspired by the ancient world and want to talk to other students who are super inspired by the ancient world, then the Classics for All student forum would be a great place to point them. So I hope that you feel that there's lots of support available, both morale boosting, but also financial. And I'll pass over now to the other members of the webinar team.
All right, before I hand over to James for our whistle-stop tour of world history, I'm just going to pause here in the first instance to see if we have any questions. So if there is anything that's cropped up from what Steve and Arlene have mentioned so far, please do leave a comment in the chat and we will try to respond to them as they come in. Have we got anything here? Oh, hi, Emma. Lovely to see you. Well, lovely that you're here joining us. And great to hear that one of your students who joined the Classical Association and Classics for All, actually, at a study day at the British Library, is now writing his NEA on ancient Greece. Good, lovely. We've got some inspired modern historians. Okay, so I am going to hand over to James now, who is a classics teacher at a school in London, but has also written several very excellent textbooks which support the classical qualifications. And James is going to rattle us through a fair chunk of world history in about 10 minutes, which is no mean feat.
Thank you very much, Gráinne. I'm going to try. I've just got to get my, there we go, and get us to the right page. And we're there. So I just want to start by also welcoming everyone to the webinar, whether you're here live or watching later. I do come from a classics background, and maybe I can add to a couple of Steve's myths there. The first thing is that classicists don't know lots and lots about ancient history. I've been in schools for the last 20 years where we offer ancient history, and I've had to learn almost all my ancient history as a teacher. just as you would. I mean, I knew nothing about the Persians before I started teaching, and they have enriched my life enormously. So that's the same for classicists. And also, I do a lot of work with teachers and from a history background, and I've learned so much from them about skill sets around history as well. So it's such a profitable partnership, and I think there is a great community. I should probably say as well that I'm the Classical Association Teaching Board rep for ancient history. So like everyone else on the panel, if you've got any questions, I'd be really happy to answer them. Grania sent me the challenge, which I've taken on gratefully, of trying to do world history, or sort of world history leading to ancient history, in 10 to 15 minutes. This is in itself a great challenge, actually. So we're going to sit back, folks, and we'll try to do about 3,500 years of history in about 10 minutes and see where the ancient history GCSE fits into this. I think I want to start by saying that the subject content document, which is a legal document, actually says that ancient history GCSE or A-level could start from 3000 BC. And there is a reason for that. So we're going to start at 3000 BC, and some of you will know some of what's going on in 3000 BC. But this is, for me, controversially, this is the start of modern history in terms of human terms, because this is when we stop being hunter-gatherers. And we start living in towns, and it sometimes calls the birth of civilization, which I suspect is very much wrong. I think civilization goes backwards when we start creating, slave labor and things like that. Probably we didn't have before, and that's a very interesting conversation to think about. But yeah, in the 4th millennium BC, leading down to about 3000 BC, we start to get people moving away from being simple farmers or hunter-gatherers into living in urban settlements, towns, cities, perhaps doesn't quite capture it. And they are around these 3 river civilizations that you could see here. So that by about 3000 BC, we have urban settlements in Egypt, on the Nile, in modern Iraq. The ancient name is Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, between the Euphrates and the Tigris, and over in the Indus Valley on the Indus River there. And what's interesting is that although there seems to be some sort of overlap, there's not a lot of overlap. They're developing in their own way at around the same time, all based around being able to create a surplus by learning to irrigate, and having, once you have a surplus of food, you can start to have a more mixed economy. I'm sure some of you have done a little bit on this, but this really is our starting point in the ancient world. And the reason for that is that our course starts, if you do the GCSE, in the year 560 BC. And I think it's really important to be aware, for those people in 560 BC, they've got their own sense of ancient history. It's not all something that collapses into one. So for them, this stuff is 2000 years old. So the pyramids, hieroglyphics that, first writing in Egypt happens in the late 4th millennium. We have the pyramids, very famous, in the middle of the 3rd millennium. This is 2000 years old for the start of our ancient history course, but it is these are civilizations and peoples and ideas which are really influencing that world of the 6th century BC. It's their sense of the past. They've got it just as we have. Maybe they were thinking it's too far back to study the pyramids. We need to do the last 100 years as well. Who knows? So we've got, this is sort of Iraq, Mesopotamia. We've got cuneiform writing emerging there. Talk a bit more about the Cyrus cylinder. And we got early urbanized settlements in the 3rd millennium. You can see an example of here. And then the one we know least about, the Indus Valley, we know least about it because it seems to have collapsed in the 2nd millennium. And I believe we've never decoded the script, so we can't read what they were saying in the way we can for the other 2. But I think we want to start there and then think, very, very macro. What does the world look like in 2000 BC? And actually, all of the yellow are hunter-gatherer societies. And then the sort of green is more simple farming societies. The North African purple there is nomadic pastoralists, I believe. The orange is slightly more complex societies, farming societies, but we've got those 3 blue bits that I've just been showing you. We've got a little bit of blue over in Chile as well, if you have a look, which is interesting. We've got those 3 blue bits, and this is where urbanization starts. As I said, I hesitate with the word civilization. And this is really also where, our ancient history course is heading. and where we start with our ancient history course. So we move forward 1,000 years, and we've got something very similar. We've got stuff happening now in China, of course, notice that, but we've got a kind of chunkier urbanizing region, sometimes known as the Fertile Crescent, really, all the way through the Near East and down into Egypt. So that's the world in 1000 BC. And that's the world into which, if you offer the GCSE Ancient History, which I highly recommend, you're going to be starting to walk into this world. And you're walking particularly into this world. So just come back a slide. There, that blue all the way around, these are different settlements. We have the rise and fall of minor empires, but no one's controlled the whole thing until the Persians. And the Persians, one of the really fascinating things about them is that they managed to unite those three river civilizations into one empire. It's not the first time Egypt's been conquered, but it's the first time that whole region comes under one people. And so I've put in at the top here where this maps onto the syllabus. This is where you start, and it's the study of the Persian Empire. So notice really that the Persian Empire is a predominantly Asian and slightly African and a tiny bit European. And again, perhaps another myth of ancient history is it's all about the Greeks and Romans. Well, actually, the foundation and the starting point for the GCSE is very much the Near East, all the way to India. So what's special about the Persians? Well, how long have you got? But this is on their palace at Persepolis. They had this huge monumental staircase and gateway, some of the casts of which you can see in the British Museum in room 52, celebrating all the peoples of the empire. They were, as we'll explore with the Cyrus cylinder a bit later on, they were very interested in actually supporting local peoples and respecting their religions. Now, yes, they were running an empire. It's not too cuddly, but their way of running empire was interesting and distinct and uncommon throughout history of working with the local elites and supporting them. So they rather celebrated all these different peoples. They celebrated multiculturalism. On this staircase, they have all these different peoples coming to meet the king. And just by looking at the headwear and the care that all of these artists have taken over actually depicting all of the people in their national dress in a way that is respectful and that supports the Persian king, but also celebrates the peoples of the empire. It's one of the things that makes the Persian Empire very, very interesting to study. Well, if we come back a little bit to this a bit, you'll see right over in the far west end of their empire, we've got the Aegean Sea. And you'll see the name Yauna there. So the Greeks, from the Persian point of view, are just this sort of slightly annoying people out at the far reaches of their empire. They're, in Roman terms, they're the Scots right up at the end of the ocean, basically. But obviously the Greeks don't see themselves from that. And one of the other reasons that we start with the Persian Empire is that this the conflict between the Greeks and the Persians, which is between 499 and 479, as you can see, this is also the moment really after which history writing and historiography is born. And we can put that into the name of one man, Herodotus, named later by Cicero as the father of history. And he sets out at the beginning of his work, which explores the Greco-Persian Wars, to say right at the start, he says, I want to find out what were the great achievements of both the Greeks and the Persians, but I also want to find out why they came to fight each other. What was the reason? And that is a kind of groundbreaking statement in the history of history. He actually uses the word historia, which just means inquiry. He coins the word history and says, I want to inquire and really analyze not just what happened, but why. And that's history. That's doing history, isn't it? That's historiography. So he's really important for our discipline as historians. And it's great that we can start with him early on. So classical Greece at this time is suddenly bursts into life, as it's known. The aftermath of the Persian Wars, the Greeks managed in combination to see off this vast Persian Empire, very much against expectations. Contributes to it a kind of explosion of culture and ideas. That culture has been there, but it's really catalyzed by the victory in these wars. So we get democracy, we get some really evolved philosophy, we get history writing, we get the birth of drama, we get extraordinary 3D sculpture appearing really for the first time. And sometimes this period is known as the Greek miracle. So again, two of our depth study options focus on this, the emergence of democracy from tyranny to democracy, or Athens in the age of Pericles, the sort of high point of its culture. So we then move on 100 years or so, and we get the conquest of Alexander the Great. Essentially, Alexander is from the north of Greece, and he flips the Persian Empire. He conquers it for the Macedonians, really, the northern Greeks. And that story is remarkable. I saw a delegate put in the chat that they had been to the recent exhibition about the Alexander Romance at the British Library. So this is another depth study option that you could do, the story of Alexander the Great, and trying to piece together what happened. We're moving on. I think I'm doing okay on the time frame. I am. So we then have a world which in the East is very much Greek. We sort of have a world where Egypt now and all the way into the Near East is Hellenized. It's sometimes known as the Hellenistic era. And so Greek ideas, Greek cultures spread, and the osmosis comes the other way as well. What's happening in the Western Mediterranean? Well, not an awful lot from a world empire point of view. There is a city in the center of Italy which is starting to just flex its muscles a little bit, and is just in charge of sort of today what would be something between Rome and the Bay of Naples, a fine place to go on holiday, which the Romans no doubt thought when they went there with all their soldiers. So Rome is kind of nothing at this point, but that's going to change. At the point that Alexander is making all these enormous conquests, no one's probably heard of Rome, or if they have, it's just a city in the middle of Italy. And the larger empire over in the West is the Punic Empire, the Carthaginians, who emerged themselves from the Near East, from Lebanon. But give it 100 years or so, and things are changing. And we get to a huge clash in the Western Med between the growing Roman Empire and the Carthaginians. So the Romans here in light blue, the Carthaginians in red. Don't worry, I won't test you on all of this at the end. And what do we have in the East? We have actually now what are sometimes called successor kingdoms. So Alexander's empire breaks up into different kingdoms. And perhaps one particularly worthy of mentioning is the green one, the kingdom of the Ptolemies in Egypt. Ptolemy being one of the generals of Alexander, he took over running Egypt. And so the last dynasty of the pharaohs are actually Greeks from this descendants of Ptolemy, this general of Alexander. And the last Ptolemy, the last pharaoh ever, Grania is going to talk about is Cleopatra. So that is what the world looks like in about 200 BC. And that's really what happens next. The Romans take over. The story of how Rome manages to become such a huge empire is a fascinating one. It's a curious one. If you read SPQR by Mary Beard, she says it's really hard to work out how between 350 BC and 200 BC, the Romans just start to take over the world from almost nothing. But they do. So what we have on the shading on this map, the orange is where things are at the death of Julius Caesar, 44 BC, and then the light green comes next, and then the dark green, including our very own Britain, 43 AD, gets added as things go on. So we get to 117. This is the time of the greatest extent, and that is almost the end, really, of my world history jaunt, except to say that actually for the subject content document, I believe it can go up to, ancient history can go up to 500 AD. And I personally would very much like to see something from the 3rd and 4th century AD, when the Roman Empire becomes Christianized, and we get the Emperor Constantine has a huge influence on world history. And we also get the division of the East and the West. So we end up with a Byzantine Empire, and then the breaking down into medieval Europe. And I think that obviously massively leads into what some of you might be teaching. There we go. I did it in about 12 minutes, Grania, I think. Enough. I think let's slide is any questions.
Brilliant, James. Thank you. I did set you quite a challenge, and you did very well, considering that you've been teaching all day as well. So thank you for that. Do we have any questions? I think I saw a hand raised at some point.
Sorry, just to say, I'm just struggling to unshare my screen here, but I shall keep working at it. Sorry about this.
I will take a look at the chat. Erin has asked, how would this work in an SEN environment? Do you mean sort of the teaching of ancient history as a whole, or the GCSE? Is there anything in particular there? I think certainly from my access to the content, yeah, I think, you know, ancient history certainly suffers the same problems that many of our subjects do, which are so content heavy, and it is down to individual teachers to think about what supports those individual students the best. Ancient history does have quite a lot of content, but I think the way that, certainly in my experience, the way that we've been able to, you know, break it down into smaller chunks, do lots of routine tests, well, do sort of like lots of routine recall, has worked quite well, also sort of to reduce the content to what is absolutely crucial. And, you know, we're able to use lots and lots of visuals as well. We do have lots of, like, there's a lot of material culture there that can support different learners. I'm also going to, Steve and James can pitch in here with their experiences of teaching to SEN students. Steve?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question, Erin. There is a perception, certainly my line manager, when I first introduced it, had the perception that ancient history would be more challenging than GCSE history. And for that reason, he suggested that we steer certain children away from ancient history. And I categorically disagree with that. GCSE ancient history is no more challenging than GCSE history. So if you have children who have particular challenges or particular special educational needs who do GCSE history, they can access GCSE ancient history in exactly the same way. In some ways, I think GCSE ancient history lends itself towards certain types of learners. For example, there is no source that will come up on the exam paper that you haven't seen. So all sources are contained in the source material. You annotate them, you discuss them, you use them. And so when you come to revise for your exams, you know that what's going to come up on the exam will be something that you have seen. The second thing to add is there's so much storytelling in GCSE ancient history that I would always start with the stories, because that's the way into the text. I would never start with the text. So if you're reading a little bit of an extract from, say, Herodotus or from Plutarch, I would always start with the story, because the story is always so colorful and so rich and often a bit crazy, very dramatic. There's lots of tension, really interesting characters. And then from the story, once we're secure with the narrative, we can then go into looking at, so let's look at the way that Plutarch or Herodotus writes about this event that we now know so well. So I would say it's no more challenging than GCSE history.
Thanks, Steve. James, did you have anything you'd like to add here?
I think Steve said you know, really the right stuff there. Maybe the one thing to add is that, as we're about to see ourselves, we're about to show, there's some great visual material content in ancient history, which I think for neurodiverse students can really sort of hook them in. I don't teach modern history, so I can't compare, but there is some really wonderful content there, which again, it's a bit like Steve's point about storytelling. You know, the image can draw them into thinking about the issues and the topic and the content.
I'd also like to add that the classics community is currently we're currently working on a review of the English classical qualifications, and we are working very closely with the exam boards to think about accessibility to qualifications as we move towards the next reform point. And we are thinking very specifically about those, you know, our grades 1 to 4 learners, and how we make sure that the content really is as accessible as possible for those learners. So it is something that we're trying to break that perception that classics and classical subjects are particularly difficult. They are very accessible, but we're trying to make them even more accessible in the future. Okay, so in this final part of the webinar then, James and I are going to discuss two of the set sources that we are so fortunate to teach as part of the GCSE Ancient History specification. James is going to talk to you about the Cyrus cylinder, and then I'm going to talk to you about Cleopatra at Dendera. So James, back to you.
Thanks. I should go back to the share, get this right this time. There we go. Hopefully I'll be able to get rid of it at the end. Struggled to do that last time. Right, come on. Computer's just being a little bit grumpy today. There we go. Okay, right, Cyrus cylinder. So, wow. I mean, again, I could probably spend more time doing the Cyrus cylinder than I could on 3,000 years of world history, frankly. So this is in room 52 of the British Museum, and this is not a controversial artifact in the British Museum. It was acquired legally in Babylon in 1879 and with the blessing of the local authorities. So that might put your mind at rest. And what's interesting is that occasionally Iran claims ownership of it, but actually it's found in Iraq. And the relationship between Iran and Iraq, or those two regions, goes all the way back and all the way back. What is the Cyrus cylinder? Well, here is a quote from Neil McGregor, who I'm sure you're familiar with, former director of the British Museum, has lots to say about history and the teaching and learning of history, and was the person who curated the History of the World in 100 Objects series as well. And he just, I think it's a good quote to start. The Cyrus cylinder is the first attempt we know about running a state with different nationalities and faiths, a new kind of statecraft. So what is the Cyrus cylinder? The first thing to say is that it is something on the GCSE syllabus which your students would be engaged with. It relates to a particular moment in the the sudden explosion of the Persian Empire. The rise of the Persians to being a small vassal state in the southwest corner of what is today Iran into being this world empire is one of the great mysteries of history, and it's one of the great achievements of history. And as I suggested in the last talk, they did this really by working with local elites and kind of saying, well, the world's going to have an empire and it's going to have rulers, and we're going to be much better than any of the other options. And they basically seem to have succeeded in that. So Babylon in 539 BC is the center of the world. It's the largest city of the world. Babylon's a sort of an evocative name. You know, we've got Babylon health apps today, and there was a TV show, Hotel Babylon. Whenever anyone wants to sort of think of an evocative place, they use Babylon. In the Bible, it was in the New Testament, you've got the whore of Babylon. It was a sort of sin and iniquity place. It was the largest city in the world, and on the Euphrates River. And the Babylonians were then an empire themselves in sort of Iraq and the Near East down to the Mediterranean. And the ruler at that point was a regent known as Nabonidus, and his father had sort of given up on worshipping, or if we believe the sources, there we go, the local god Marduk, the main Babylonian god, and had taken up worshipping the moon goddess Sin, appropriately named or hilariously named. There's some great names in ancient history, by the way, which will make your students laugh as well. And so basically what Cyrus did is he wanted to conquer Babylon, the Babylonian Empire. He walked in, he marched in, he conquered Babylon, and he presented this as a liberation. And he basically said, I've come in to liberate you from this heretic king, this local king you've got. Marduk has sent me, your main god. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to liberate the captive peoples here, because there were various peoples of the Babylonian Empire who had been moved into Babylon as captives. And I'm going to send them home, and I'm going to send home their images of the gods. And I'm going to have them all set up where they belong again, because this is a sort of empire where we're going to work with you, and it's going to be much better than what you've known before. Now, I'm hoping that all of your year 10 students are now saying, oh yeah, well, he would say that, wouldn't he? You know, that's what all rulers try and do. All autocrats, they tell you, you know, how great they are and how kind they are, and it's rubbish. And that would be a fantastic response. And that's the sort of response you want from them, that here is an imperialist conqueror saying, I'm going to make your life much better. But, and this is where ancient history, I think, becomes so interesting, there is really clear evidence that he did actually do this, and that he did look to work with these peoples. And interestingly, none of the peoples mentioned on the Cyrus cylinder as having been liberated, among them is not included the Jews. But in the Bible, we do have very clear testimony that this is what happened, that the Cyrus is the only non-Jew in the Bible to be given the title Messiah. I believe that there are 6 or 7 in the Old Testament known as Messiah. It just means the anointed one. And obviously that was then applied to Jesus in the New Testament. It means the special one of God. Cyrus is the only one who was actually given that title in the Old Testament. He was seen as a liberator. And again, the great thing about ancient history studies is it's always relevant to the present. So we have, think about this, an Iranian king who is seen as special to the Jewish people, an Iranian ruler, not something we would see today. And so, you know, that's just a very interesting talking point. And Cyrus, we were also told, had the temple in Jerusalem rebuilt. So this is a really different type of empire from, you know, those of you who are doing, you know, the British Empire, for example, other modern European empires. There's less evidence of this going on, of actually rebuilding native temples in native styles. So he's a very, very interesting man, Cyrus. We have, this is his statement of liberation of the Babylonian people. And we can see from other texts that these sorts of things were going on in other areas as well. They really were interested in supporting local peoples, basically saying, look, you get on and live your way. That's absolutely fine. We're not trying to convert you to our gods. We respect your way of life, but pay us your taxes and give us your troops and basically go along with the way we want to run things overall. So what could you make of that? I mean, obviously there's the whole history there of showing you of the 2 sources, and the fact that we might be really cynical about Cyrus until we put him alongside what we're told in the Bible by one of those liberated peoples. We have evidence in the Greek sources as well of Persian respect for Greek religion. But I think, again, one of the things I've mentioned this a bit, but just to really, one of the great things about ancient history is that it's always there. It's always being used. And it's a brilliant subject for basically studying how people use and abuse history as well. And any study of history, I think, should be looking at that. You know, how do people use history to fit their own narrative? And just the Cyrus cylinder is very interesting. I mean, the Jewish tradition is interesting. Just I put in the Rembrandt painting here because the story in the book of Daniel in the Bible is that the night before the sack of Babylon by Cyrus, Nabonidus, I think it is. It's Belshazzar, isn't it? Nabonidus is out. He was actually the king. He's out. The Belshazzar is the regent in Babylon, and he has a vision of a hand writing on the wall saying, "You've been weighed and found wanting, and tonight the Persians shall conquer your enemy, your empire, your city." And actually, that's where we get the phrase "to see the writing on the wall" from. So there's these little anecdotes and stories and phrases that we're like, "Oh, crikey, didn't know where that one came from." So that comes from the conquest of Cyrus. If we come across to the right, probably your students might not be over familiar with Boney M, Rivers and Babylon just yet, but they will be at some point, surely. This is really interesting. It's a great song, obviously, by a Caribbean pop group here. But the psalm that this refers to is all about the captive Jews I think it's Psalm 138. I apologize for not knowing that off the top of my head, but it's all about the captive Jews in Babylon in the 6th century who will go on to be liberated by Cyrus. And that psalm becomes incredibly important in later history, particularly amongst African-American slaves. It is sung amongst the slave communities of African America as a kind of aspiration. We will get out of this horror one day. And so you know, that song, that pop song, although, you know, you think it's great fun and it's actually got this incredibly long legacy of being a really important liberation song, goes all the way back to the 6th century BC. And I think kids find that really interesting, that, you know, this stuff has a really long back stage. And then the 2 at the bottom, it's just, you know, again, the use and abuse of history. In 1971, the Shah of Iran, who was deposed in 1979, who had an appalling human rights record, he basically set up as a huge celebration the 2,500th year anniversary of the Persian Empire. had lots of world leaders and all the rest of it. It was a classic. It was probably his death knell, really. It was so lavish and expensive while people were starving in his country. But for him, the Cyrus cylinder was at the heart of all of this. There is the official logo. And he actually got the UN to kind of see the Cyrus cylinder as the first Charter of Human Rights, which it certainly isn't. But it's still, you still heard that tick about, oh, it's the first Charter of Human Rights. It's not a Charter of Human Rights. So again, just the use and abuse of history. And you might think that the modern regime, the religious regime since 1979, views the Persian Empire. They're very ambiguous about the Persian Empire, and they see it as un-Islamic very often, and also associated with the Shah. But even Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, when the Cyrus cylinder traveled to Iran in about 2010, he went and viewed it and said, oh, this is a wonderful, you know, the Iranians, we're people who really love human rights. And again, as with the Shah, perhaps one might think that the reality, particularly at the moment in 2023, is not quite that. So there's so many conversations in different directions that come out of this one artifact, as well as actually studying what was going on then. It's like the afterlife of this is amazing, and there's so much for you to work with. So enough, and I'm going to hand over. We're going to to Egypt now. If I can get out of this, that's the only thing. Stop share. Yeah, I can. And Grania, back to you.
Lovely. Thanks, James. Okay, now it's my turn to share screen. Here we go. This is going to work. All right. So James has just obviously spoken to you about the Cyrus cylinder, and now I'm going to pick up and talk to you about Cleopatra. We're so lucky that we get to teach Cleopatra as part of the GCSE Ancient History specification. And we're going to take a look at one of the archaeological sources, which is the depiction of Cleopatra and her son Caesarion, who she had by Julius Caesar. At Dendera, the Temple of Hathor at Dendera, which is this image here on the right. Funnily enough, it's not the one that's on the left. We're really sort of chucking the history at you today. I'm going to give you a sort of a whistle-stop tour of how we end up with Cleopatra's image on this temple of at Dendera, and how she became Queen of Egypt, in order to sort of give this source some context. We will be going into Rome's, and I've sort of borrowed this map here from James. We will be going into Rome's relationship with Cleopatra in more detail in our Roman History 101 session. So I won't dwell too much on that here. And I hope you'll be able to join us for that later session in the series. So as James mentioned, after the death of Alexander the Great, his general Ptolemy founded the Ptolemaic dynasty that ruled Egypt for almost 300 years. And it's at the end of that dynasty that we meet Cleopatra. The Ptolemies were Greek. They were Macedonian. They're from the north of Greece, which made them a Greek family of Egyptian pharaohs. So they coexist as Egyptian pharaohs and Greek monarchs. And Hellenization of Egyptian daily life was a very significant feature of Ptolemaic rule. And this is quite key to remember, as it begins to explain why we see Cleopatra think very carefully about her public image, think really carefully about who her intended audience is when she is trying to uphold both of these different roles. So as I mentioned, and as James mentioned, there is already an existing relationship between Egypt and Rome, and at this point in the Ptolemaic dynasty, their power is weakening and they are becoming ever reliant upon Rome's assistance, and Cleopatra is very much one of these people who really needs Rome's help. Here is sort of the briefest of brief timelines from the birth of Cleopatra up to the point where we see her add her image to the temple at Dendera. Cleopatra's claim to the throne was unstable. After the death of her father, she was meant to be co-ruling with one of her brothers, Ptolemy XIII. She is expelled by her brother, she has to leave Egypt, and she only makes it back into Egypt with Rome's assistance. And there is a civil war in Egypt that erupts over this sort of dynastic struggle within the Ptolemaic family. And, you know, Rome's intervention here doesn't exactly help matters, because the Egyptians have obviously got these hybrid Greek Egyptian rulers, but they're also now being helped by another outside source. They've got Rome's intervention here. So there's a lot that Alexandria at this point is a very tumultuous city, which is where Cleopatra and the Ptolemaic dynasty is based. And it's a really, really difficult period of Cleopatra's reign. Ptolemy XIII dies as part of this civil war, and Cleopatra returns to the throne with another brother, Ptolemy XIV, and he also mysteriously dies. Some say at the hands of Cleopatra. She was ruthless, to say the least. And it is at this point, after the birth of Caesarion, who's the son that she has by Julius Caesar, that we see her finally have sort of sole rule of Egypt. She is the pharaoh along with her son. I hope that gives us sort of a very brief overview as why we have these sort of very different, or why we have these very different images of Cleopatra. She does have to sort of move between these different roles of Greek monarch, Egyptian pharaoh, ally of Rome. We can see these different images of Cleopatra in these three images that we've got here. The coin at the top depicts a diademed bust of Cleopatra. Her hair is styled in the very traditional Greek fashion, and she has the Hellenic diadem around her head. And she also has the very prominent nose and chin that very immediately associates her with the Ptolemaic dynasty. So this acts not only to make her lineage very clear, but it also very intentionally emasculates her. She wants to be seen as a capable and legitimate successor to her father. In the bust below that, again, we see the Hellenic diadem around her head, but this bust is Roman, and we see her facial features sculpted much more in keeping with the Roman style, because it's intended for a different audience. And one of the set sources that we get to teach in the GCSE depth study is this relief that we see on the right here, which is of her and her son Caesarion at the temple complex at Dendera. So Cleopatra's father had begun erecting a temple to Hathor, who was the Egyptian goddess of fertility and beauty. And after the death of both of her brothers, and after the death of Caesar, and after she then has, she has control of Egypt with her son, we see Cleopatra add her image to the rear wall of the temple complex. And we see her, I think this is the better image, we see her depicting herself as Hathor, accompanying Caesarion, who is her chosen successor and who is pictured here as a pharaoh. We have Caesarion here shown very much as an adult, although at the time this was created, he was probably quite young. But Caesarion here is wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, symbolizing the role of the pharaoh and uniting the land. The falcon of the god Horus is just above him. Cleopatra is wearing the headdress of Hathor and is holding the sistrum used in the worship of Isis. And both of these figures are making offerings to the Egyptian gods in this picture, to the Egyptian gods, including Isis. So here we see them very deliberately presenting themselves as traditional pharaohs of Egypt. And this is what is one of the really brilliant things about teaching ancient history. We get to teach this Cleopatra. She's such a remarkable female figure from history, and as is often the case with so many female figures from history, she has been very unfairly treated by history, and it's such a joy to be able to really sort of debunk all those myths and stories that are out there about her. she is so much more than the doomed lover of Mark Antony. So that is a little bit on two of our set sources, and that really sort of brings our webinar to a close. Are there any final questions? Is there anything that any of us have covered at all today that you would like to pick up on at this point? I don't think we've got anything that's come up in the chat. Okay, well, if you are just adding anything into the chat, do we have a question?
Just a nice bit of feedback, really informative. Thank you from Emma.
Oh, good.
Thanks, Emma.
Lovely. Our next session is going to be a Greek History 101. So it's going to be more of us trying to condense enormous periods of history into a 1 hour window on the 25th of April. That session will be led by, well, myself and Steve, but we'll be joined by Professor Lloyd Llewellyn-Jones from Cardiff University, and Emma Beetham, who is a modern and ancient historian. She teaches both at York College. If you would like any more information, if you need some time to sort of condense everything that we've, process everything that we've thrown at you today, please do not hesitate to contact me. My email address is education@classicalassociation.org. I'm very happy to sort of pick up on individual queries. You can also like and subscribe in all the usual ways. We do have a lot of support available for teachers, as Arlene mentioned. Lots of resources on our website. We are also running CPD, a free CPD year-long programme in collaboration with Classics for All. So please do reach out, and we would look to be able to support you in whichever way we can.